Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Christianity in Corinth, Acts chapter 18, verses 1 through 18. We've been following the travels of the Apostle Paul as he comes to the Aegean, going from Philippi to Thessaloniki, Berea, Athens. And now as we come to Acts 18:1, after these things he left Athens and went to Corinth. The city of Corinth, notice this blow up of the map, you can see the route from Athens to Corinth. Corinth lies on this narrow isthmus that connects Achaia, as it was called, to the Peloponnesian Peninsula. As you go there today, there's a canal that has been dug in the last 100 that goes through the isthmus. Back then, that wasn't there, although Nero tried to. Corinth itself was a Roman colony. Now, it had existed long before the Romans came along, but it had been destroyed when the Romans came. And then, in the year in which Julius Caesar was assassinated, just before his assassination, early in the year, he decreed that it should be rebuilt, made into a Roman colony, and it was. It was here that we find the proconsul's seat, and we're actually looking at the bema, the platform on which the proconsul would sit as he dispensed judgment. And we're going to actually see that bema here in Acts chapter 18. In the distance, you see the Acrocorinth, the great citadel, the great area that overlooked the city of Corinth. And up at the top of that, you have a temple to Aphrodite, which gave Corinth sort of the attitude of love your neighbor but don't get caught, that sort of thing. Um, and it was known as sort of Sin City. You might think of it as a ancient version of Las Vegas. It was known for its pagan temples, not just the temple to Aphrodite in the distance. Here we're standing in the temple to Apollo, and it was filled with pagan temples. People would bring their sacrifices, they would offer them. And then when the priest had finished with the sacrifice, he would go out the back door. Notice this is the same temple. And now we're standing in the marketplace. He would bring the meat that had been sacrificed to idols, and they would offer it in the marketplace. Sort of a pagan version of kosher foods. And the Christians are going to actually ask the question, is it proper for Christians to eat these foods, these meats, which have been offered to idols? After all, that's what you buy in the marketplace. Can we go shopping in the marketplace, or do we need to find a Christian alternative? Acts chapter 18 and verse 2 is coming back to Paul, and he found a certain Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus. Pontus is one of those provinces in ancient Anatolia, where we call Turkey today. And notice, having recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius is the emperor that was pictured over here on the right, Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. Now, we're told in secular sources that the reason for this expulsion of the Jews had to do with some controversy over someone named Chrestus. When Tacitus tells us, he's the historian that records that, he doesn't know the difference between Jesus Christ and anybody else. So he hears Chrestus and he thinks that must be the person's name rather than the title Christ. In any event, notice he came to them, this is Paul, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and they were working, for by trade they were tent makers. It was customary among the Jewish people, even if you were going to go for advanced education, that you would learn some sort of trade in which you could engage if all else failed. And so Paul, his trade was tent making. And notice that he and Aquila and Priscilla formed sort of a business partnership, at least insofar as they are working and sort of staying together, and they have this affinity. And these two, Aquila and Priscilla, if they hadn't already been, they're going to become Christians. Verse 4, and he was reasoning in the synagogue every Sabbath and trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. Now, we haven't found the synagogue in Corinth, but we did find this column. Notice it has three menorahs engraved on it, which signifies that Jewish presence about which the book of Acts mentions here. Verse 5, but when Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia, Paul began devoting himself completely to the word. You see, because they come down, they're able to either help support him or perhaps bring in some funds that would allow him to put tent making to the side and now go completely, notice, to the word, solemnly testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. Now he gets to go into full-time ministry. You say Paul wasn't in full-time ministry? Well, at times he wasn't. At times he had to be what we would call bivocational, where he would work to support himself in ministry. And other times, when the funds allowed that, he would put tent making aside and he would go completely into the word. Verse 6, and when they resisted, that is the Jews, he blasphemed. Notice, they resisted and blasphemed. He shook out his garments and said to them, your blood be upon your own heads. I am clean. From now on, I shall go to the Gentiles. So notice he had gone to the Jews first, to the synagogue. That's where the people who already understood and believed the scriptures were. But since they had, by and large, not completely, but many of them had rejected the message of Christianity, now he turns to the Gentiles. Then he left there and went to the house of a man called Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. I'm assuming from his name that he has a Latin name, and I'm assuming from his name that he's Latin, perhaps Roman. But notice he's a worshiper of God and one who now has presumably turned to Christianity, whose house was next to the synagogue. So here Paul had been teaching regularly in the synagogue, but when he is rejected, he goes next door to the house of Titius Justus. I almost imagine like a sign, Bible studies here, and pointing to the synagogue. But now he moves next door, so he just scribbles the sign. We've moved next door to the house of Titius Justus, and he continues teaching right there in the presence of all. And Crispus, the leader of the synagogue, believed in the Lord with all his household. And many of the Corinthians, when they heard, were believing and being baptized. Notice that baptism goes with believing. You say, wait, what about those that baptize children? Well, I'm sure that happened as well. But at this point, they were hearing for the first time. They weren't Christians prior to this, so they are believing, they're being baptized. And notice it even reaches this one Crispus, who is the leader of the synagogue, which tells me if Paul had been rejected from the synagogue, that Crispus also is going to be rejected from the synagogue. Verse 9, and the Lord said to Paul in the night by a vision, do not be afraid. And notice the translators place any longer, and maybe that was the case. Maybe he had been troubled and wondering about this growing opposition. But notice, do not be afraid, but go on speaking and do not be silent. Now, does this suggest he had been to a measure silent, or at least was being tempted to be? Perhaps. For I am with you, God says, and no man will attack you in order to harm you, for I have many people in this city. Now, that means there are some that were already coming to Christ, but God says, I have many that you don't even know about because they haven't heard the gospel. You keep preaching, and my people are going to come. I think that's fascinating that God uses this idea of what we think of as election and predestination as an impetus for Paul's preaching. He says, you keep on preaching because I already have selected these people. I have them. They are my people. They just don't know it yet. And they're going to come if you will continue. Verse 11, and he settled there a year and 6 months teaching the word of God among them. We haven't seen Paul settle in any particular location for this long up to this point. You know, we've seen him on this missionary journey where he wasn't even allowed to preach the word as he went through Anatolia and Asia, and then he had come to Europe, And he'd spent a little bit of time in Philippi. Remember, 3 weeks in the synagogue at Thessaloniki, and then maybe a little bit more time in the church. But now he's going to stay here in Corinth for quite some time, a year and a half, as he's teaching the Word of God. Verse 12, now we're going to come to a civil trial. Notice, while Gallio was proconsul of Achaia. Now, Gallio was we know actually of him from secular sources. He was the son of Seneca the Elder, also well known as a writer. He had been adopted by the Roman senator Junius Gallio, which is why he has this name, and he's proconsul in 52 AD. And that's a very short term, but he's going to get sick after this, and he's going to resign, give up his commission. Remember, a proconsul, that's like a governor. It's, a consul would be like a president, and there were always two consuls, but then a proconsul, there'd only be one of them for each area. So he's the Roman appointed governor. You don't get any higher in that area than the proconsul. And he's going to be the VIP representing Rome. And so while he is governor or proconsul of Achaia, the Jews with one accord rose up against Paul and brought him before the judgment seat. And we're seeing the platform again here, the bema, saying, this man persuades men to worship God contrary to the law. But when Paul was about to open his mouth, but when Paul's getting ready to preach the gospel to Gallio, like he had done, remember, he had been before an earlier proconsul. He had been before Sergius Paulus over the island of Cyprus. But Gallio interrupts him. Gallio said to the Jews, if it were a matter of wrong or vicious crime, O Jews, it would be reasonable for me to put up with you. But if there are questions about words and names and your own law, in other words, your Jewish law, look after it yourselves. I'm unwilling to be a judge in these matters. So he refuses to hear the case because it has nothing to do with Roman law. It has to do with Jewish understanding of the Torah, and he is not an authority in that and doesn't claim to be, and so has no jurisdiction there. He refuses to hear the case. So verse 16, he drove them away from the judgment seat. And they all took hold of Sosthenes, the leader of the synagogue, and began beating him in front of the judgment seat. And Gallio was not concerned about any of these things. Now notice Sosthenes, the leader of the synagogue. You used to say, well, I thought Crispus was the leader of the synagogue, but he had become a Christian. And so the Jews had deselected him from being leader of the synagogue. He was no longer leader of the synagogue. He was with Paul. And so now we have a new leader of the synagogue, and this one is Sosthenes. Here we go. You've got Crispus. Remember, he had been the previous synagogue leader, but he had become a Christian. He'd gone over to Paul. And as a result of him becoming a Christian, now Sosthenes had become the new synagogue leader, and he had brought charges. I'm assuming he was one of the ones who brought charges against Paul. And what happens to him? He's taken, maybe perhaps by the Romans, perhaps by the Jews. I don't know who did it, but they give him a good beating. And meanwhile, Paul is just sitting there looking on. What I find fascinating about this is when I get to 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 1, where Paul writes, called as an apostle of Jesus Christ by the will of God, and Sosthenes, our brother. Now notice, Paul's not just saying that Sosthenes is with him. He is giving Sosthenes credit as partial author of the epistle to the Corinthians. Did you ever stop to think that 1 Corinthians was actually written by not one person, but by two, according to what Paul is saying? Now, maybe it's just an honorary mention, but he mentions Sosthenes, who is helping to write this epistle to the other Corinthians. He became a Christian. Perhaps his beating got his attention.